This is the second part of Chapter 5 of A Beginner's Guide to Jungian Psychology by Robin Robertson. The persona and its relationship to the shadow. Jung called the face that we present to the world our persona, referring to the masks which the Greeks wore in their tragedies. However, the use of such symbolic characters is hardly limited to Greek drama. For example, the Japanese have similar masks, which they use in their no dramas. Each mask represents a fixed or character type. The Balinese use similar symbolic figures in their puppet plays. The Punch and Judy figures, with their unchanging characters, are perennial favorites of British children. And though they didn't wear masks, heroes and villains in American westerns were, until the day of the anti-hero, similarly fixed character types. We all recognized the evil landowner, the cold-blooded hired killer, the innocent damsel in distress, the alcoholic doctor, the tough barmaid with a heart of gold, the pure as the driven snow hero, and so on. In the Western world, in the late days of the 20th century, a man's occupation can frequently become his persona. That is, a man becomes an engineer or a computer programmer to such an extent that he forgets he is more than his job. Until recently, women had little or no opportunity for any adult roles other than mother, or old maid, school marm, librarian, etc. Every woman who marries and has children knows how difficult it is to get other people to see her as a person in her own right, as someone other than her husband's wife or her children's mother. She herself frequently has a hard time imagining herself, except in those strongly archetypal roles. We all need an identity, and rather than struggle to define our own unique identity, most of us are willing to take on a collective identity like mother or father, librarian or computer programmer. But those roles are like masks, which we can't change expressions. No matter what the situation, we have to react within our predefined character. When people are stuck in their persona, they appear shallow to us. They don't arouse much interest because they literally lack depth. Similarly, we build up an ideal view of ourselves, kind and gentle, yet strong and forceful, or trustworthy, loyal, helpful, brave, clean, and reverent as the Boy Scouts would have it. Any such picture composed exclusively of what we regard as good and right is too light. It lacks the dark shading required for completion. For example, in Britain in the latter half of the 19th century, the masculine ideal was the gentleman with his exquisite self-mastery. The complement of that ideal was a savage who was unable to control his instinctual drives. Of course, both these images existed only in the British mind, not in reality. Under the illusion that they were in total control of their lives, the British upper class was in fact dominated by their unconscious. Driven by a need to find the savage necessary for their completeness, British males pushed colonialism to its extremes, dominating India and Africa, and all the other places of the world where they imagined savages dwelling. The British colonists set up house in each country and attempted to live exactly as they were still in England. In the middle of Africa, the British gentlemen put on starched collars, read their daily London Times, which was probably 6 months old by the time it reached them, and had their tea. More than anything, these colonists feared their fellow companions, unable to resist the pull from the unconscious, which had gone native. In order to develop the self-discipline necessary for such insanity, young British boys of the upper class were sent to schools schools, where they were savagely beaten and frequently sexually molested by both their teachers and their fellow students. Their need for the repressed darkness and savagery led them intellectually to masochism and sadism. Unable to connect sexually and love because it required some diminution of their conscious role of dominance, they became homosexuals in quite extraordinary numbers. Or consider an even greater phenomenon, Christianity and the shadow it has left in many of us. In sharp contrast to the patriarchal Jewish maxim of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, Christ presented the world with a new, softer, more feminine idea. Love thy neighbor as thyself. What Christ was really expressing was the knowledge that he was not truly separate from the people around him, that he saw something of himself in everyone with whom he came into contact. But such a realization requires self-knowledge, and self-knowledge comes only from a long struggle with ourselves, and especially with our shadow. His followers chose to take the golden rule as just that, a rule to be followed, much like they had followed the 10 Commandments of the Jewish religion. It is easier to just say that we have to love our neighbor, regardless of whether we do or not, than it is to search in the parts of ourselves that we would prefer to leave in the dark. Similarly, in following Christ's ideal, it is much easier to see him as perfect, incapable of sin, than it is to see him as a man struggling successfully with the contradictory sides of his own nature. What else could Christ do except struggle? Composed as he was equally of God and man, in following Christ's ideal, we need to struggle with reconciling our essential animal nature with our equally essential divine nature. We need to find the divinity in the instinctual in the divine. Instead, Christianity developed an ideal of perfection, of light without darkness. Darkness is split off and attributed to Satan, rather than being seen as a necessary part of our nature. If there's light, there's inevitably darkness to compensate. Therefore, all the neglected and repressed parts of the personality gather around the shadow and become associated with sin and evil. Projection. Jesus also taught that we should first look to the mote in our own eye rather than to the evil in our neighbor. Psychologists use the term projection to refer to this attribution of our own characteristics to others. It's important to realize that projection is an unconscious process over which we have no control. The goal is to gain enough consciousness that we no longer have to project our shadow onto others. If we are sexually repressed, a shadow figure forms who gives way to every sexual impulse. The more we deny that we have any such evil desires, the more energy gathers around that shadow. Eventually, there is so much energy that we no longer confine it to the unconscious. It comes shooting forth. Sometimes it possesses us, and we do things we would prefer to forget about afterwards. Boy, was I drunk. I don't remember a thing. Or we project the shadow out into someone around us. Projections aren't totally indiscriminate. There has to be some sort of hook for the shadow to attach itself to. But if the energy is strong enough, the hook doesn't have to be very close. In our example, we might project our shadow of savage lust out into anyone who wasn't as repressed as we were about sexually. Once the projection was in place, we would attribute all sorts of characteristics to that unfortunate person, which had little or nothing to do with their actual personality. That's why our dreams present us with shadow figures. In dreams, we can engage with them in safety. In the unconscious, we can have our arguments, fight our battles, and slowly come to respect their point of view. Gradually learn to become a little looser ourselves, but if we remain consciously too rigid to make any changes in our value system, transcends our normal functional approach to life. The transcendent function attempts to restore wholeness by bringing repressed or ignored aspects of the personality into consciousness. Seen in that light, the shadow provides an opportunity to grow. If acknowledged and related to, we grow. If denied and repressed, the shadow grows stronger until we have to acknowledge and relate to it. The psyche is attempting to make us grow, whether we like it or not. The girl with mechanical abilities. Let's return to our example of the little girl with mechanical ability. Forced to turn away from her masculine mechanical skills, she probably developed a persona that was excessively feminine. She couldn't admit any masculine traits in her personality because some part of her knew that just how much she would have liked to tinker with her car or design bridges or fiddle with a computer. So she was forced to condemn anything even vaguely part of the supposed masculine world as unfeminine and therefore repugnant to her. Let's imagine that she married a big tough man who liked to wear the pants in the house. For a while she simpered and cooed over what a big strong man he was and thought she liked her life. Soon after marrying she had a little girl, then 2 years later a little boy. Now, it is a decade later. She loves both her children and still loves her husband, though she has recently found herself growing tired of constantly having to play up his superior ability in everything of significance. She doesn't know what is wrong with her lately, but life seems to have lost its zest. She finds herself just going through the motions. We who are outside looking in on this woman's life can readily see what her problem is. She's lost part of her soul. She's no more the person she thinks she is than she's the Queen of England, but she lost her shadow so long ago she doesn't even remember she had one. Thankfully, it's still alive in the unconscious. Perhaps one night she has a dream. She can't remember it, but the dream has a disquieting effect on her. She's moody all the next day. A few nights later she has a dream that she does remember. It's a nightmare where a woman is chasing her, a terrible hulking woman with hairy, heavy, muscular forearms. She knows if this woman catches her, she will crush her because the woman is as strong as a gorilla. She wakes in a cold sweat. Later that week she thinks she sees the woman in the supermarket. When she looks closer, she can't imagine why she thought it was the woman from her dream. This woman was dark and had hair on her arms, but otherwise looked nothing like the woman in her dream. Later in the day, she sees an old I Love Lucy episode where Lucy and Ethel are trying to build a barbecue pit in the middle of the night. She laughs, but for a minute finds herself thinking about how she would have built the barbecue pit. The thought passes so quickly that she doesn't even remember having it. Well, I won't take you through all the stages. It might take a very long time. Usually there would be some moment when the woman would cross her personal Rubicon. Most probably this would surface in some very slight action that she would not notice at the time. Perhaps one day she just couldn't stand a dripping faucet 1 second longer. She had nagged her husband about it for weeks, but he'd ignored her. So she grabs a wrench and a washer and fixes it herself, without even realizing she knows how to fix it. She doesn't mention it to her husband. In fact, she tries to forget the incident entirely because it makes her feel uneasy. But from that moment on, her course is set. Perhaps the reader might argue that the situation is too simple. Life is more complex than any such easy summary. Granting that, consider that even this example is far from simple. This woman isn't going to change and become Josephine the plumber. She isn't going to lose the femininity she prizes so much. However, she might end up losing her husband. She is probably married to a weak man because a strong man would have expected a real woman, and she didn't even know what kind of woman she was when they got married. As she relationship between evil and the shadow, and discuss some practical techniques for integrating the necessary qualities of the shadow into our own personality. The shadow and the problem of evil. The living form needs deep shadow if it is to appear plastic. Without shadow, it remains a two-dimensional phantom, a more or less well-brought-up child. When people first hear of Jung's concept of the shadow, they usually envision something like the dark force in the Star Wars movies. They think of a struggle between light and dark, good and evil. Remember our discussion of how Christianity, with its goal of perfection, has far too frequently led to just such dichotomies, not only within each individual, but also within the entire Christian culture. If everything good is attributed to Christ and everything evil to Satan, there is no room for any shadings or ambiguity. Christians are good and everyone else is bad. The history of Christianity's pogroms against the Jews are sufficient evidence of the results of such belief. But of course, Christianity is hardly alone. Islam, for example, has an identical split of darkness and light, good and evil, built into its religious dogma. In the Middle Ages, with Christianity and Islam equally convinced of moral rectitude, we had 300 years of the 9 bloody wars we call the Crusades. Can there be many episodes in history more reprehensible than the so-called Children's Crusade, when thousands of children marched off to serve Christ and ended up sold into slavery? History reverberates with the calls of the morally righteous. Juan de Torquemada, leading the Spanish Inquisition, Cotton Mather, aiding and abetting the Salem witch trials, more recently Jimmy Jones and the Guyana mass suicide, Khomeini and his fanaticism. The list is endless. As soon as light is split off from darkness, we classes, but there it's taught without any moral judgment, for moral judgments are not considered the province of science. The story is about John B. Watson, the founder of the prevailing psychology in America, behavioralism. Watson was fond of saying that if you gave him a child young enough, he could make him anything you wanted, a scientist, a lawyer, a criminal, whatever you wanted. As proof, he once conducted a famous experiment on an 11-month-old boy named Albert. Watson coupled a frightening noise with the sight of a rat until the poor baby was terrified of rats. When Watson generalized the association until Albert was frightened of all sorts of things, dogs, wool, furry objects, a Santa Claus mask, Watson had intended to see if he could then remove the fear by similar techniques. Unfortunately, Albert's mother, a worker at the hospital, left the hospital, and Albert was left with his fears untreated. In this case, the light was science and the darkness ignorance. Anything that increased the light was good, so no matter what was required. Let me give another example from psychology. The famous experiments conducted by experimental psychologist Stanley Milgram in the early 1960s. When Milgram began these experiments, he actually hoped to prove that Germans were different from you and me, and that thenceforth the Holocaust couldn't happen here in America. He was planning to first conduct his research in America, then go to Germany for the second stage of the experiment. He never got beyond the first stage. Milgram asked an experimental subject to help him with a learning experiment on another person who was supposedly the actual subject. That second subject was supposed to select the word that best associated with another word from a list of 4 or 5 words. If he picked the wrong word, he was given a small shock to encourage him to get it right the next time. If he missed again, the voltage of the shock was increased. The experiment presented was actually a phony. There was no shock given to the supposed second subject. In fact, the second subject was another psychologist who was in on the experiment all along. The real point of the experiment was to see just how far the actual first subject would be willing to go in giving the electric shocks to the other person. The real subject had to administer the test, turn a dial to set the amount of the shock, then push a button to give the shock. The machine had a dial that was labeled all the way from slight shock to danger, severe shock. Past that point were unlabeled points supposedly beyond the bounds of the test. Milgram wanted to find out just how far people would go before they would refuse to administer any more shocks. Neither he nor any of his colleagues expected very many people would go on to the end. They were wrong. Every subject did. Milgram was startled and redesigned the experiment, making it more and more macabre in the process. He made a tape beforehand of the supposed subject crying out, begging for help, screaming, and at the end of the test, totally silent as if he had passed out. Still 65% of the subjects proceeded on to the end of the test. The subjects didn't just blithely push the buttons. As the test went on, they reacted as any human being would. They begged Milgram to let them stop. He coldly told them to go on. They pleaded that the subject was dying. Milgram repeated that the subject was safe and that the experiment must continue. That was the key phrase. The experiment must continue. Astonishingly, Milgram never did realize that he had placed himself in exactly the same relationship to the people administering the shock as they were to the subject who was supposedly being strapped in and receiving the shock. Milgram insisted that if he had been one of the subjects, he would have stopped, yet in effort he was, and he didn't stop. His manipulation of his subjects, lying to them from the beginning, was bad enough, but at the start of his experiment he never thought that it would lead to such terrifying results, such potentially damaging psychological results for his subjects. However, after the first experiments, when he found that it did, his humanity responses. The morality of the situation was lost in the rush for more data. There has since been so much experimentation of this kind that one wonders if it is any longer possible to find a subject who will believe a psychological experimenter. After all, isn't it a given that the experimenter might lie to you, but all in the interests of science, you understand? C.P. Snow considered the limits of the scientific attitude of detachment in his novel, The Sleep of Reason. In this novel, two middle-aged women, friends, perhaps lovers, are put on trial for torturing a small boy. They did so largely out of curiosity, and with a dispassionate clinical quality that would not have been out of place in a research laboratory. In the course of the trial, all our normal attempts to distance ourselves from such actions are confounded. It becomes clear that within any normal definition of sanity, the two women are perfectly sane. It also seems likely that the event having been committed would never be repeated. Though their act was monstrous, they are not monsters. We can't find any line which will separate them from us. As the trial went on, the reader was forced more and more to the conclusion reached by the 19th century barrister, who, after having condemned a man to death, said, "There, but for the grace of God, go I." Or, as Albert the alligator says in Pogo, "We has seen the enemy, and he is us." We are all afraid of looking at the monsters that we fear lie within us. The ancient story of Pandora's box counsels us to leave hidden things unexamined, yet it is precisely when we don't examine our hidden side that it builds to monster proportions and comes bursting forth into the outer world. Once we begin to acknowledge that the monsters we see without live within, that danger is abated. Instead, we find the beginnings of the wisdom that every supposed monster can teach us. Perhaps we can understand Milgram's subjects. We can even understand Milgram himself. If we stretch ourselves, we can put ourselves in John B. Watson's shoes, and that's a first step which we need so desperately at integrating the shadow. Working with the shadow in your dreams. When you find yourself in conflict with someone else in a dream, assume that the other person is a shadow figure who possesses some quality that you need to integrate into your personality. Making this assumption is correct nearly all the time in dreams. The times when you are truly in the right and the dream is accurately summarizing the situation are infrequent enough that you can consider them the exceptions that prove the rule. The more intense the struggle, the more sure you can be that you're dealing with a shadow figure. Similarly, the more repugnant or disagreeable you find the other person, the more likely that it is a shadow figure. At first, this is hard to acknowledge, since shadow figures invariably represent qualities that we refuse to admit are part of our own personality. But once you accept this premise, you will come to regard shadow dreams as presenting opportunities for advancement rather than merely disagreeable, nightmarish interludes. If you consciously accept that you are dealing with a shadow part of your own personality, you will find that over time your dreams display the evolution of the shadow that I mentioned earlier, from inhuman to despised human to tolerated human. Invariably, there is also an evolution from vague and amorous to more sharply defined. This is because as your consciousness engages with the unconscious, the definition of your particular shadow will become more precise. When you are dealing with a part of your personality that has previously projected, you are hardly in a position to make fine shadings of value when you first encounter the shadow. Later you will come to discover that your unique unconscious abilities actually are. Don't worry if during this process of confronting the shadow you fail to consciously understand what it represents. Just keep honoring it by admitting to yourself that the shadow is probably right and you are probably wrong. Most often the issue will resolve itself long before you are able to consciously understand what the issue was. For example, a patient had a dream where a cheap, greedy black man owned issues are coming close to resolution, there is frequently an ambiguity of identity in a dream, especially ambiguity between yourself and some other figure. For example, a middle-aged female patient had a series of dreams where it wasn't clear to her if she was in the dream herself, or whether it was some young woman quite a bit younger than the patient's actual age. The dream symbolism indicates that a merger of the middle-aged woman and a younger part of herself was close to occurring. Spotting the shadow in everyday life. Learning to recognize the shadow in your dreams helps you recognize the shadow in everyday life. Look for emotional outbursts. If someone really gets on your nerves, he or she is likely to be carrying your shadow for you. You are projecting your shadow onto someone who provides a hook for it. In those cases, rather than stay with the emotion, try and tell yourself that it is your issue, not his or hers, and that you are protecting the shadow. This is much more difficult to accept in everyday life than it is with dream figures. Even when you consciously understand the process of projecting the shadow, you will find yourself denying that you're doing it. You will keep saying some variety of yes, but to yourself, the angrier the person makes you, the more sure you can be that you're encountering your shadow. Shadow anger will have an unreasoning quality about it which you can gradually distinguish from the righteous anger you experience over true injustice. Again, it's best in the early stages of dealing with shadow issues to always assume that it is your issue, not the other person's. You won't be wrong very often if you make that assumption. Gradually, you will progress in dealing with shadow projections. At first, you will only be able to recognize the projection after the fact. Don't be discouraged. That's the first step towards removing the projection and integrating the shadow. Later, you will find that you can recognize the projection in real time. That is, you get angry, blow up, then immediately realize that you're projecting. Still, later you recognize your anger before it comes out, and consequently you don't have to express it. Once you get better at the process, there will nearly always be an inner pause between an event that triggers anger and the expression of the anger. You can then choose to express the anger because it is appropriate, or suppress it because it is inappropriate. This conscious suppression of anger is far different than unconscious repression of anger because you are afraid to deal with it. Projection is an unconscious process. Once you become aware of your own projections, they gradually cease. Shadow figures then move to your dreams where you can deal with them more effectively than